Hey, campfire crew, let's get it on. Stalked Over Kindness by Vaultmaid. Just to preface this story, this happened about 12 years ago when I was around 13 years old. The memories and emotions of this incident have faded away into the back of my mind, but recently I started having flashbacks of this incident, and it led to multiple panic attacks while driving or in public. After some deliberation, I thought perhaps writing about it and sharing it with a community that might understand the fear of experiencing this sort of thing might help me feel validated with my emotions. So here goes. I was a 13-year-old living abroad when this happened. To give a short background info that might help you understand the story better, I was living in an apartment complex. Every morning, the school buses would arrive at the main entrance of the entire complex and pick up the kids for school. The church I was attending at that time also operated buses to help people get back home, so every Sunday after services were done, I would take the church bus back home. I never doubted my sense of security and safeness, since this was the kind of system that made me feel safe and protected. That was until I met him on one Sunday morning. I was a church kid, and quite an involved one, too. I was serving the youth group as part of the welcome team for newcomers when I met him. He entered the chapel with his mother following behind, and she explained that they had recently moved to the country and were just starting to settle down. My first impression of him was that he was lanky, shy, and very quiet. He seemed so harmless, innocent, naive. So when his mother left him after filling out a form, I gave him a smile, greeted him, led him to an empty seat, and I thought nothing more of him until I saw him again in my small group. So I greeted him again, saying something like, "Hey, so nice to see you again." And I still remember how he just shyly nodded, not really answering me. When the small group time ended, I took out haichu, a Korean soft candy, and I gave one to everyone in the group, even the teacher. And as I handed the rectangular candy to him, he softly whispered, "Thank you," and walked away. That was the first time I'd ever heard him speak. I hadn't realized that he was living in the same complex as me until I got off the church bus and saw him coming down the steps of the bus as well. It was a funny coincidence, so I told him how weird it was that we were in the same small group and also living in the same complex. He nodded again, and I walked off first because he was waiting for his mom and little sister, who were coming behind him. My apartment building was number 20, the first in the row of buildings. I'd opened the door and was about to go in when he followed behind me. Me, still in that newcomer greeting mode, responded to this by asking if he was living in the same building as well. He nodded again, and I noticed that his mother and sister were not here yet, so I got into the elevator first, asked him if he was going to wait for them, and gave him my goodbye when he quietly nodded yes. The next morning, I saw him waiting in the lobby when I got out of the elevator. He was alone, and I asked him if he was waiting for his sister, and he nodded, so I just gave him a quick, "Hey, have a nice day," and ran off so that I wouldn't miss my school bus. Then for every day of that week, I saw him waiting for his sister in the lobby, standing in the corner right in front of the elevators. I didn't think much of it. I would always say hi or good morning to him, and he would just nod or wave timidly. There was nothing more to it than that. That is, until one Sunday when I got back home after church. He was walking behind me, this time together with his mom and sister, so I thought I would be a nice girl and hold the door for all of them. So I waited, holding the door open, only to have all three of them walk right past my building. Strange, I thought, so I peeked my head out to see that they were entering building number 15, which was 5 buildings down the street. At first I didn't think much of it, thinking that they might have moved out of building 20 and into building 15. But when I stepped out of the elevator the next morning to see him again in the lobby, in the same corner he would stand in every morning, my heart sank. I don't remember how I responded to it, but I do remember choosing not to confront him because I was in denial that this was actually happening, and I didn't have the courage to ask him for an answer. things quickly progressed since that day, and I started getting late-night calls to my cell phone. The typical, I'm not going to speak to you, but just going to breathe heavily kind of calls that you get that makes you feel insecure even though you know you're safe in your room. He also stopped waiting for me in the lobby since that morning, but he would stand in the far corner of the street every day and watch me wait for and get on my bus. I was starting to become hypervigilant, and that didn't help with the situation either. I could always spot him watching me, even though he would often try to hide behind a thick tree or the guard's cabin. At church, I kept up my bright facade, but would distance myself as far as possible to avoid any sort of contact with him. I actively put distance between him and me, because whenever I decided to say hi to him, instead of returning my greetings, he would just stare right at my face, then drop his gaze down to my private areas. The fact that it was summer and I was wearing shorts didn't help at all whenever he stared at my thighs and between my legs. The shame, the embarrassment, the feeling that I was being dirtied by his gaze, the anxiety and the paranoia was too much for me. I started skipping the small group session and left right after the youth group ended so I would avoid getting home with him at the same time. On days that I did happen to attend small group, I just sat quietly, unwilling to speak a single word, while he stared at me intensely. One day, while the teacher was leading the discussion, he suddenly burst into an angry yell shouting, "Why do you keep ignoring me when you clearly know that I like you?" Needless to say, I was embarrassed, ashamed, and shocked, and terrified, all at the same time. The teacher tried to de-escalate the situation, but he stormed out after yelling about how frustrated he was with me for not returning his affection. I wanted to leave as well, but the fear that I might run into him made me sit in my seat while everyone in the group quietly whispered amongst themselves about this sudden drama that happened right before them. It was a huge shock to me that he was doing all these things because he liked me. But what shook me more at the moment was the fact that the teacher didn't seem to be fazed at all by this sudden outburst. She didn't seem surprised by the fact that he had such feelings for me, and instead she just casted glances at me with some sort of knowing in her eyes. I'd always wondered how he got a hold of my phone number. This was it. The teacher dismissed everyone but asked me to stay. I was always the model student at church, but the moment I was left alone with her, I lost it. I cursed and swore and demanded her to tell me if she knew how much he was making my life miserable. She told me she knew he liked me. Apparently, he started liking me because of that stupid-ass candy I gave him on the first day. She had given him my number because she thought it was cute seeing him like me so much. So I told her what he had been doing, how he waited for me every morning in the lobby even though he lived in a different building, how he would stare and watch me from the corner of the street, how he would stare between my thighs and my chest, and how he would call me late at night with the heavy breathing and all. I was having trouble speaking and breathing because of how much I was crying, but I remember yelling, "He's like a fucking stalker!" That was when I fully recognized that I was being stalked. When I became quiet due to the shock of that realization, the teacher took her chance to speak and told me that he was a mentally troubled kid who didn't know any better, so I just needed to bear with it. That was the end of that conversation. Honestly, there's a gap in my memory after that day, so it's hard for me to recall what events had led up to it, but the last time I saw him was when I had the most fearful encounter with him. I was already on the church bus, waiting. There were two girls sitting a couple of rows ahead of me, and the bus was silent other than that. I was sitting by the aisle when I saw him get on the bus, and the strange thing was that when he got on, the two little girls suddenly turned extremely hostile towards him and told him to get the fuck off the bus, calling him a fucking pervert. He responded angrily, "Well, you whores aren't the ones I want to see anyway, so shut up." This was the first time I heard him speak such profanity, so I honestly was shocked. Then he fixed his eyes straight at me, walked over to where I was, and sat a row diagonally behind my seat. My heart was pounding at this point, and I wanted to sit by the windows to hide from his gaze, but I was scared that he would think of it as an invitation to sit next to me. So I stayed frozen in my seat until more people came on the bus, and then only moved to the window seat when an adult asked if they could sit next to me. I think there was an instinctive feeling that told me I couldn't get off together with him, so I purposefully got off at the stop before my apartment. It was only about a 600-meter walk from the bus stop to my home, so I mixed in with the people and got off the bus with them. The bus had stopped by the side entrance of another apartment complex, and I just needed to walk down the street to get to mine. But the street was empty and deserted because it was one of those areas that were waiting to be developed by the city. So I started walking towards my home when I realized that he had also gotten off the bus with me. He was walking a few feet behind me, and my gut wrenched as he got closer and closer. Something told me being alone with him on the street was dangerous, so I broke into a run until I saw an alleyway that parted off from the road. In my panic, I turned into the alley and was relieved when I saw that there were some smaller shops that were busy with people. There were people hanging out in the alleyway, chilling by the benches outside and stuff, and I was certain that he couldn't have followed me into the alley after I had run. But I still looked back behind me to check just in case. There he was, still following me. He was running after me. My relief quickly turned into terror, and I hastened my pace, purposefully weaving in between the people in hopes of losing him. But whenever I looked back, I could still see him. Eventually, the people hanging by the shops thinned out, and now I was walking in an empty alleyway. On the opposite end of the alley, I could see that there was a bigger road with more cars and people, and I was already quite out of breath as I wasn't a fit person. But with my last strength, I ran for the busy road, hoping to lose him if he still was behind me. I stopped once I reached the busy road and turned around to look into an empty alley. I stood for an extra minute staring into that alley to confirm that he wasn't following me. Then fortunately, my friend's house was close by, so I stayed at her place until I felt it was safe enough to walk back home. That was the last time I saw him. I stopped going in the small groups. I started serving in the children's department as an accompanist so I could avoid going to the youth group. I didn't see him again after that, but one time I happened to meet my small group teacher, and she told me that he had left the country. Apparently, he was reported multiple times at school for lewd behavior, such as sneaking into the girls' restroom, and that's why the girls on the bus were grossed out by him. In the end, he had been expelled from the school. I think that was when I decided to bury the terror and fear away because he was no longer an immediate threat to my life. Funny story, though. After that whole incident, I had to watch Ferris Bueller's Day Off at school. But the moment Ferris's friend Cameron Fry showed on the screen, I had to run to the bathroom to throw up, because the actor's face looked exactly like him, and just looking at his face brought back the trauma. Now I can watch the movie, but looking at Cameron's face still gives me anxiety. Anyway, I often wonder what might have become of him, and I wonder if his parents knew what his son really was. If he was truly suffering from mental illness, my only hope is that he received the proper treatment, so that no one else has ever had to go through what I had to. Vacation in the Philippines, submitted by Bjorn E. First off, I'm a white Norwegian male, age 36. I'm 5'11" and about 180 pounds. Since 2006, I've been traveling alone all around Asia and Europe at least 5 weeks every year. I've traveled by car, plane, train, bus, and motorcycle. Back in 2007, I was 22 years old, naive, and still new into traveling solo when I had my first 5-week trip to the Philippines. With only a small backpack and a bag, I was traveling from Manila down south to the Philippines and then back up, of course stopping at all the cities that I could. The trip was amazing, and I didn't have any worries or problems at all. The people have always been nice and talkative too, especially down south since there's less tourists there. So, since I'm a bit of a control freak, I always make sure to have enough time before my departures, making me spend 1 to 2 days in the city I depart from every time. This time, I had about 30 hours in Manila before departure, so at my last evening I decided to go out to have a final vacation dinner and a few beers at a bar, just to finish off my vacation there in a nice and relaxing way, and then prepare for going home. My hotel was in one of the, let's say, less nice and less central parts of Manila. I always spent as little money as possible on a room. I mean, after all, I was just going to sleep there and not spend too much time indoors. I got comfy in the hotel, got a nice shower, and changed before going out. During a stroll around, I found a nice little bar that had some snacks and simple meals. I mean, not a hardcore bar, just a simple, relaxed, small one. After I consumed my food and beer, I started to walk back to the hotel, and it was around 1 a.m., and warm as hell. People always warned me about walking the streets there at night, but as a tall, foreign, white-haired man, I really didn't worry too much. It was only a few blocks to the hotel, and it shouldn't have taken me more than 15 or 20 minutes to walk back. In one of the small alleys, a guy in his early 60s, I guess, stopped me and presented himself as a reporter of some kind. Before I managed to do any talking myself, he asked if I could see the 3 guys following me. I turned around, and in close distance, I could see some ragged-looking guys staring at me. The reporter then said that I had to follow him for my own good. I asked what this was all about, and he just answered that we should go now if I wanted to ever walk again. So as naive and inexperienced as I was, I tagged along. I was trying to ask him some questions about what was going on, but he only hushed me off, telling me to be quiet and not to ask so much. As he dragged me along into the darkest and nastiest alleyways I have ever seen, I started to get a bit worried, and I understood that something really wrong was going on. Whenever I turned, the guys were still following at the same distance the entire time. Suddenly he stopped and opened a door on the side of a shady-looking building. He then told me to get in, and of course I did, before he smacked the door behind me. I tried the doorknob, but it was locked. I knocked, then banged on the door. Nothing. I did this repeatedly, but there was only silence both inside and outside. At this point, I was starting to panic. I couldn't see how this was going to end in a good way. I tried to look around in the room, but it was pitch black. I used my hands and followed the wall around 1 and 2 corners until I found something that felt like a door. It had a doorknob, but it was also locked. At this point, I was high on adrenaline, angry and scared all at once, so I started to kick and slam myself against the locked door. Luckily, I'm a pretty solid guy, so after a few bangs, the door frame broke where the lock was attached to it, and the whole thing ripped open. The door led out into a hall where there was an exit, a staircase, and more doors that I think led to other rooms or apartments. Many people in Manila, there are students, workers, etc., only rent small rooms in the main cities and buildings like this. I heard the door from the room being opened, so I fled through the exit and heard the guy shouting and yelling in both English and Filipino. I made a run for it as fast as I could, until I reached my hotel. When I arrived, I told the hotel security what had happened, and he told me that I had been very, very lucky. He also told me that it wasn't the first time something like this had happened. We filed a police report that same night, but the police said that things like this never get followed up on, especially since I came back in one piece and unharmed. I still travel there, but to this day, I still think about what the hell would have happened to me if I didn't manage to get out of that room. It freaks me out every time. Hopefully you can use my experience on your podcast, maybe even as a warning to other new solo travelers. Who knows? How many people did get out of situations like that? And where are they now? Middle School Mystery Man by Silent Joker 780. This story takes place a few years back. I was 16 and my cousin who was with me was 21 at the time. We'll call him Jay. We're rural town boys. Never really much to do, and Jay and I grew up together, so we were very close, and we always did everything that we did together. One night, he decided to stay at my house with me while my parents were out of town. We didn't really do much. We made some food, played some video games, etc. It wasn't long before we got kind of bored. And in the past, Jay and I had gone for night walks just around the neighborhood. We would just walk around and talk about stuff, things that were bothering us, girls, whatever really just came up. This particular night, Jay had suggested that we go for a night walk. He had a lot on his mind at the time, as did I, so this walk was going to be a little longer than the usual ones. I live about 2 miles from our old middle school. However, it's not in the direction of the nearest town, so we don't ever really see it. We decided that we wanted to roam over there and just hang out and talk about our different times spent there, kind of like taking a trip down memory lane. When we got there, we looked at the building through the chain-link fence for a while. We sat there pointing at stuff and telling each other stories for about half an hour. By this point, it had already turned about 12:40 a.m. Jay had suggested that we hop the fence and then go sit down on the roof shelter that was closer to the school building, but not quite close enough to the cameras that were attached to the building. I agreed with this idea, as I wasn't really tired and still had more things on my mind to talk about. I remember walking over to the Ramada and seeing from a distance that the only camera facing the gym building had been broken and was hanging down, pointing straight at the ground. I remember thinking about kids playing wall ball and accidentally throwing a ball too high on an occasion when I was at school, so I really didn't think much of it. Jay and I sat there and talked for a while, and I realized that it was already 2 a.m. I was just about to say to him that we should probably head back when we heard the loud metal door of the gym suddenly open. There were windows in the doors for the gym, but there had been no lights on in there at any point. It was pitch black in there the whole time that we'd been out there. We ducked down and peeked over the wall to see who was coming. The school had lights all around the building, but the Ramada that we were at did not. So we could see him very well, and we were hoping and thinking that this guy couldn't see us. The man that walked out didn't look like anyone we recognized in our time there, nor did he look like he even belonged there at all. He was a very dirty, ragged-looking man, long hair, probably about shoulder length, and he was wearing a black hoodie with his hood up. We tried as hard as we could to not move or make any noise as we watched this man walk out, look up at the sky, take a deep breath, and then walk behind the school's tool shed, which was about 15 feet to the left of the door that he had come out of. Upon getting behind there, he let out a sound that I can only describe as a growl. Then we heard a loud bang, as almost if he punched the back of the shed. Jay and I gave each other a WTF look before whispering to each other that we needed to hop a different fence to get out, because he would see us jumping the one that we had jumped over to get into this place. We looked back, and he was already back by the gym door, so we crouched down, walked out of the Ramada, and a little ways out before we decided to stand up and make a mad dash to a much farther out fence. When we got to the fence, we looked back and didn't see the man anymore. And Jay hopped up onto the fence, and as I was climbing up, I heard him say, "Oh shit, hurry up," as he jumped up higher and grabbed my jacket to tug me upwards. When I got over the top and was dropping down to the other side, I looked back to see the man had circled around and was only a few yards away from us with something in his hand. My skin started crawling. I was sure he was holding a hammer, but he stopped when he got over to the fence and was just staring at us. But when we started to jog away, we looked back and saw him sprint to the fence and hop it a lot faster than we did, and upon seeing that, we began to sprint as fast as we could until we got back to my house. We had taken a longer way with more turns and had lost him very early on. We made sure everything was locked in the house, and I grabbed one of my dad's guns, and the 2 dogs that we had slept in my room that night. Nothing happened, so we were sure we did lose him. We never did find out who he was or why he was there, but we never went there on a night walk ever again. That's for sure. My creepy story, submitted by Not My Last Rodeo. I've been on a horror story binge, and it's prompted me to reflect on my own personal experiences. Initially, I didn't think that I would submit any stories because I honestly don't consider my life to be all that scary. But the more I think about it, I know it's more true than that I've had some really terrifying moments in my life, and I'm just lucky to have good mental health now and the ability to brush it off. For example, I was wrongly incarcerated for forgery and grand embezzlement when I was 18. I've driven my friends to the hospital as they overdosed in my back seat, And once I even dated my boss, who had 2 strikes on his record for physical assault. He was an ex-Crip from L.A. I'm not looking for a round of applause. I know it's not too cute to constantly be in toxic situations. But I swear that my actions have always been motivated by a need to help others, and a desire to make people who are often left unheard feel heard. But that open-mindedness on a tiny alternative teenage girl attracts a certain type of crazy. I'm very strong. I can do like 5 pull-ups with a 35-pound plate strapped to me, and some other cool tricks like that. I consider myself smart, and I graduated as valedictorian of my high school. Because of these things, I'm overly confident, and that sets me up to be tricked and scammed. I'm sorry, I'm rambling, but I think it's important for you to understand that during these dire experiences, I thought of myself as a strong person who was simply navigating a difficult situation, and not a weak person who had been forced into a situation beyond their control. This will be relevant later in the story when you're asking yourself, why didn't she just stand up and walk out the unlocked door? I always think I have everything under control. But just so you know, about half of the story will just be me catching you up so you can better appreciate the day in question, so bear with me. I want to share a story about my ex-almost boyfriend, Jeremiah. It was summer of 2017 and I was 17 years old. Jeremiah and I weren't officially dating, but we would smoke weed, have sex, and talk about our lives together. To catch you up on some much-needed history, Jeremiah and I shared a large friend group from way back in middle school. So even a few moments into actually talking with him, I was under the misimpression that I knew him to be a relatively decent person who had been a friend for years. One of our joint friends threw a party in his mom's suburban home, and Jeremiah introduced himself to me while I was decompressing in the back room. We made out that night. However, there were a million red flags right away. Right after making out, we almost had sex right there on our host's bed, but we were interrupted by the partygoers barging in. Everyone encouraged us to get back to the party, and the mob of sweaty teens exited the room with Jeremiah, and me following. When it was just us lollygagging behind, Jeremiah stopped me and made a point of telling me how one of the girls from his class, 3 years above my class, was trying to start drama and was telling everybody that he had pressured her into sex. But he said, of course, it was just a rumor and just Amethyst starting shit as always. You're asking yourself, are all the red flags going to be this blatant? The answer is yes. Jeremiah was really pretty, with thick blonde hair down to his butt, blue eyes and light skin. He was funny and charming enough that we started to visit each other, and I would drive to his mom's house to hang out with him a couple of times a week. I drove to him because even though he was 20, he didn't yet have a license. I quickly learned that Jeremiah had been diagnosed with bipolar, anxiety, and ADHD, and he lived in his mom's house after having dropped out of high school because of his mental health. I don't want anyone under the impression that I was daunted by his mental health issues. I mean, quite the opposite. I was intrigued and curious. I also have ADHD, and I was riddled with anxiety, so with limited references for the severity of his diagnosis, I started considering his mental illness to be almost irrelevant at the time. But mental illness isn't irrelevant, and it was very wrong of me to assume that just because we had similar diagnoses, our anger or passion would be expressed in the same way. Not to mention that manic depressive bipolar can present itself in very aggressive ways. Particularly during manic episodes, people can be easily agitated, explosive, or even violent. This is less true with ADHD and anxiety, as I had experience with. Jeremiah seemed isolated, and I pitied him. He seemed left behind with no classmates or coworkers, and unable to go anywhere, but I still believed he had potential. I don't trust a grade to tell you much about someone's intelligence anyway. He was sarcastic, hilarious, and good fun to be around. Plus, not only was he pretty like Legolas, he was packing a solid 9 inches, and I'm 100% not making that up. I mean, sex almost hurt. But he had many disturbing fixations, one of which was slutty women. That's not a problem in and of itself, but he seemed so grossly over-sexualized women constantly. He would make a point of how much he liked big boobs and would point out girls with sheer tops where you could see their cleavage, saying things like, "I love how she's clearly trying to show off for all these desperate men. What a slut. You should dress like that." but he presented his love of slutty women like it was a harmless kink, and at the time, I just guessed it was only that. A couple of times, some of our joint friends and some of my friends from outside that group would tell me that they thought Jeremiah was a little weird. But the unfortunate thing was that I didn't feel like I had to deal with his issues so much because I didn't have a future with him in mind, and he would say the same for me. We were very casual, referring to each other as lovers but not boyfriend and girlfriend. I was on the pill, and he had made it very, very clear that he did not by any means want a child, and if I got pregnant, I would have to abort it. Don't get me wrong, I didn't want a kid, but the idea almost angered him. I guess it's good that he knew he wasn't up to the job of being a father, but his intense emotions around the subject may have had something to do with his difficult family life. Jeremiah's dad had left the family at some point in his childhood, and Jeremiah also had a very complicated relationship with his mother. Her and her son barely interacted in their small apartment. She stayed up in her room, he stayed in his, and when Jeremiah talked to her, about 50% of the time, it was admiration for her strength as a single mother and sincere gratitude for her support of him into his 20s, while he struggled to get his life going. The other 50% of the time, he would speak about her in a violent and aggressive manner, filled with intense rage. He would call her a lazy bitch and whore, but never to her face and always almost jokingly. The amount of denial I managed to whip up when confronted with all these obviously terrifying signs was insane. A couple of months into knowing him, I started understanding what his mania looked like. Part of rapid cycling bipolar is manic days or weeks that lead you to doing absurd and often dangerous stunts. You are often unable to sleep, and in extreme cases, you can fall into a delusional state due to sleep loss. Here's a handful of the tales Jeremiah shared with me about his episodes. He told me about one day he went to the bathroom, emptied every box of Band-Aids there, took all of the non-adhesive backing off, and put every one of them on in attempts to cover every inch of his skin. Or he would put on every article of clothing he owned, beginning with all of his boxers, all of his pants, his socks, his t-shirts, sweaters, hats, swim trunks, gloves, and everything else he had in his closet. I even heard about a particularly bad evening where he felt his manic urges kicking in on his way to the store, and he chose to walk a solid couple of miles down the road and across a bridge, pushing an empty grocery cart that he had brought with him, singing loudly with no music, and with everyone in the public looking on. With his long hair, crazy blue eyes, and his disengaged and disheveled look, he must have looked like a homeless junkie. But all of the examples of his episodes until the day in question had been absurd, not dangerous. For some reason, I never guessed that his mental illness would manifest as violence, an assumption I probably came up with because of my ADHD tantrums at the time were just me sobbing angrily for hours. But one night, things were different. Understanding the layout of his mom's apartment is a little important for this next bit. It was a 2-story apartment with the kitchen and living room on the ground floor. Jeremiah's room up a small flight of stairs, and after the landing at his room, the small flight of stairs continued up to the landing at his mom's room. I drove with my mom to Jeremiah's place, and she dropped me off and headed away to do errands with the car. Jeremiah didn't greet me at the porch as normal, and when I stepped into the apartment, it was extra quiet. The atmosphere, though, was tense. Apparently he and his mom had been fighting. Now remember, at this time I was 17, and that would make him 20. My parents, while wary of their relationship, were relatively okay with me hanging out with Jeremiah despite the age difference. But Jeremiah's mother was pissed about it, and apparently had been since the beginning. With my perspective now, I understand that she really just didn't want Jeremiah in trouble. But I knocked on his bedroom door, and he wrenched it open, ushered me in, and quickly shut it. Jeremiah was angrily explaining that his mom thought I was going to call the cops on him because I was underage, which was weirdly accusatory, since I figured he knew I wouldn't abuse my power, and it's not like we had ever fought. But then Jeremiah got a text from his mom, who was only upstairs. She seemed to just be too meek to come out and be upfront with her son. The text read simply, "Have fun going to jail." Jeremiah began to panic, which was sort of fair. I mean, she wasn't being a great mom at that crucial moment. He began pacing back and forth in his bedroom, running his hands through his hair, and verbally snowballing to worse and worse conclusions. He started by saying things like, "This is so bad, I'm going to have to kill myself." So I walked to him, took his hands in mine, and I asked him to look at me. We took some deep breaths together, and I urged him to either sit or lay down on the bed and explain what was going on. He eventually sat down with me, and we breathed slowly together while he told me how fed up he was. I got him to lay down, and I played with his hair, and I truly felt the roughest waters of the evening were behind us. But in a strange, disorienting instant, Jeremiah had rolled over and pinned my hands down at my sides, straddling over to me to sit on my hips. He reached down and grabbed my throat with both hands, and while I grabbed both his wrists, he tightened his grip. This was not romantic choking. This was meant to damage me, and I was pissed off. That moment, I was annoyed because I'd been so patient and helpful with him during his freakout. I looked him dead in the eyes while I dug my incredibly long nails into his forearms so deep that they drew blood. Eventually, he let go, luckily before I fully blacked out. "So, did you get up and leave, you may be asking?" No. I felt that it had to be a one-off occurrence. I mean, hey, he was working through a lot of fear, and it was probably manifesting in actions that he wouldn't normally do. So I stayed and attempted to calm us both down, but he eventually got up from the bed and returned to his pacing. His ramblings and ravings evolved from suicidal to homicidal as he began colorfully illustrating all of the violent things he wished he could do to his mother. He then said he thought he ought to light the whole house on fire so that all of us inside would burn with it. I convinced him to lie down again and take some deep breaths and relax. He came back, but not more than a minute passed, and he was back on his feet. I anxiously watched him walk away toward the bathroom attached to his bedroom, and then saw him come back to me with a Swiss Army knife open in his hand. "What are you doing?" I asked as he clambered back on top of me. Jeremiah held down one of my wrists with his foot while he sat on me, holding me in place. He just stared at me, tracing the knife over my thighs. And I glared back and spent a solid 5 minutes coaxing him into giving me the knife. I told him that he was scaring me and that I needed to just see the knife. I said that sentence very quietly but firmly over and over again. Reluctantly, he eventually handed it to me, and I sternly asked him to get off of me, which he did. I got up and walked towards the door where my purse and keys were. I dropped his Swiss Army knife in the purse, and then, you guessed it, I went back to the bed to calm him down. I'm a person who has many times scared people off with my extreme emotional snowballing, particularly when I was a younger teen. I used to have a little-known symptom of ADHD, rejection sensitivity. I would be triggered by something insignificant that I would perceive as rejection or failure, and I would just be so deeply hurt and in my feelings, and all your doom-filled thoughts felt so real. I didn't want to make him feel misunderstood or abandoned the way that I had felt when people left me in the thralls of an episode. So I stayed. After 10 minutes curled on the bed together, talking quietly, he got up again and walked back only a few seconds later with a baseball bat. Why do you have that?" I asked apprehensively. "Oh, I'm not going to hurt you with it," he said. "Why on earth would I think you're not going to try to hurt me with that after everything you've done this last half hour?" "Put the bat down," I instructed. "No," he said, walking back to the bed. He seemed relaxed, like he was just taking care of something real quick, not like when he had had the knife and had been so focused and calculating. I was scared, and in my head I remember thinking to myself, I don't fuck with blunt force trauma, and I got up and walked to his bedroom door, grabbing my purse and keys. I was scared he was going to grab me, and while he reached out and said my name, he didn't grab me. I closed the door and scampered down the stairs and quickly put on my shoes at the front door, when I paused. Wait a minute, I thought to myself. He's going to kill his mom. Fuck. I listened for a minute, having a hard time listening for footsteps over my heartbeat drumming in my ears. But then when I decided he wasn't going to wrench open the door and chase me, I tiptoed back up the stairs as quietly as I could, past his landing, and to the landing right outside his mom's room. I knocked twice, too quietly, and I didn't wait for a response and entered her room, shutting the door behind me, physically shaking. "What do you want?" she snapped. I was caught off guard by her hostility, but I had forgotten that Jeremiah's mom was still upset about the whole age dispute. I was lost for words, grappling with a way to tell her that her son was both homicidal and suicidal. Instead of just telling her how it was, I garbled out an incomplete, breathy sentence full of lots of panic and not a lot of information. "Your son, he wants to hurt you. He just tried to hurt me," I remember stammering, but I continued. "He needs you. He's having a really hard time." I just stood right in front of her bed, pressed against the closed door. "Well, I'm having a really hard time," she shouted at me. "Get out of my room." For a moment, my mind was blank with disbelief as I looked at her. It was at that moment that she said that childish BS. I decided I had done my duty for trying, and she was being too much of a bitch to be worth putting myself in more danger. I muttered something like I was just trying to help under my breath, and turned to slip quickly out of her room, back down the stairs and out the front door. When I got out of his house, I ran across the street into a familiar restaurant where I barricaded myself in the bathroom stall and asked myself out loud if that had really happened. So for some people, I'm sure the next course of action would be clear. Report him for violence and for attacking me. But I have a deep distrust of the police from my own personal experiences, one of which I cited earlier in the story. And I've seen the abuse that cops do to mentally handicapped and mentally ill people, simply because they didn't understand why a person was acting the way that they were. Not knowing of any alternatives, I chose to not report anything, and I called my mom to drive back the car to me. I asked to drive on the way home to calm my nerves, but I didn't share my experience right away. I actually told my dad about it first, as a sort of offhand joke in the car after he picked me up from high school the week after. As he drove, we briefly discussed the other day's events. He stayed his chill, composed self while asking if he needed to kill this kid, or if I had already taken care of it. I told him everything was under control and not to worry because my ridiculous sense of security and overly inflated ego makes me trauma-proof. Also, I promised that I wouldn't be interacting with Jeremiah again, but I ended up keeping the Swiss Army knife for a year before this story came up in a conversation between a joint friend of mine and Jeremiah's. I pulled out the knife and said, "He tried to stab me with this, but I don't want it, so you can return it to him at some point. Or you can keep it, or throw it away." My friend wasn't shocked. He had been a voice of caution from the beginning, but he took the knife anyway, which I appreciated. I've since learned that Jeremiah is doing better. He was holding a job the last time I heard about him, and seeing a therapist too, which is respectable. There are a few lessons to be learned from this story, but when I was told this advice, I sure as hell didn't listen to it. You're not a bad person for being real with yourself about whether you're up for supporting a partner through their mental illness. Some things are beyond your expertise, and while everyone wants to give people chances, if people tell you they have a problem, just assume they know something you don't, and take it seriously. That being said, I'm still fucked over all the time because I trust too easily, and I believe in second chances. But it's hard to change when I'm pleasantly surprised at people's kindness and generosity 95% of the time, so who knows. Thank you for reading this, Uncle Josh, and thanks for everybody for listening. The Woods, submitted by Ian. I know this sounds far-fetched, but I'm telling the truth about everything that happened in this story. Keep in mind that I don't scare easily. This happened about 6 or 7 years ago, and I've told plenty of people. I was going through a tough time, and I just wanted to be alone. We have this set of woods beside our house, so I decided to ride my dirt bike out there at night, sit by a fire, and just chill with some music. About an hour or so later, I wanted to change up the music, so I grabbed my iPod and started to surf through some songs till I found something that I liked. Now, I forgot to mention it, but at night the woods are pitch black out, and even with a fire you can only see a few feet around you. Basically, you and the fire are the only ones in a sea of darkness. Anyway, I switched songs and turned back to the fire, and then froze. On the other side of the fire, a large form with pointed ears loomed in the darkness. The only reason I noticed it was because of glowing eyes, reflecting the flames that burned between us. I mean, this thing was huge. I'm about 6 feet tall, and it was taller than I was. I stood there, paralyzed in fear for what seemed like minutes, only the music breaking the dead silence. I live in Ohio, so not a whole lot of tall animals in the woods with pointy ears. We have no bears of any kind or wild animals in the area that are bigger than deer. The thing before me was definitely no deer, and at that moment, I didn't think it was human either. During our silent standoff, my brain finally recovered from shock and screamed for me to move. I quickly dropped everything in my hands, including my phone and iPod. I just jumped on my dirt bike and tried to start it. Just like in a horror movie, it wouldn't start. Dread filled me, and I could feel my face going pale. But the engine turned over really slowly as if the battery was dead. I thought my heart would break my ribs. I was pounding so hard. Luckily, my bike had a Kickstarter as a backup, though I've never had any luck kickstarting it. I guess luck was smiling down on me that night, because with a hard kick, it started, and I flew through the woods as fast as I could. Looking back on it now, I'm guessing whatever it was could have attacked me with all the time it took me to get the dirt bike working. I don't know if it already left during my panicked escape, or if it was still standing there watching me with those fiery eyes as I fled. Once I got to my house, I told my parents about what happened and asked my dad to go back with me to grab my phone and iPod. But it was really late, so he declined. I'm guessing he didn't believe me. Now, don't ask me why I would go back after escaping with my life, but at the time, I wanted to go back for my stuff. They ended up calling my friend who lives nearby, and he agreed to help. My friend and I shit you not, went back out to the woods with swords and a disposable camera to get my stuff. I took the camera with us in case I could snap a picture of whatever was out there with me. As I was snapping pics in one hand and holding a sword in the other, we approached the site and gathered up my things. The thing was nowhere in sight. As we were walking back up to my house, we noticed a neighboring house was lit up, though. However, it wasn't house lights. The house was on fire. We quickly called 911 and ended up finding out it was an abandoned house that caught fire. I'm not sure if it had anything to do with what I saw, but it was sure weird to have all this happen in one night and all around the same time. To this day, I have no idea what animal that would be taller than me would approach a fire in music. Not sure if it was some kind of weird creature or possibly a person in a mask. I mean, maybe it was the same person who started a fire. I still have the disposable camera sitting on my desk. I haven't gotten around to getting it developed, but now thinking about it as I write, I probably should. A lot of time has passed, and I still go out in the woods, but sometimes I can't help but wonder if that thing is still out there, watching me. Hey gang, thanks for listening to this episode of Uncle Josh's True Scary Stories. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have a true scary story you'd like to hear narrated on my channel, email unclejoshtruescarystories@gmail.com. I read them all. I know I'm not the best with social media, but follow me at the links below on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. If you're trying to save on bandwidth, you can also find my podcasts and archives on your favorite downloadable podcast player. Spotify, iTunes, Apple Podcasts, you name it, I'm there. It looks like we're going to get out of this crazy pandemic hopefully sooner than later, and I'm looking forward to that as much as I know all of you are. Until next time, be excellent to each other. And remember, be wary of things that go bump in the night. It could be anything. A ghost, a monster, or the guy next door. Hey gang, this episode of Uncle Josh's True Scary Stories is brought to you by 3D Comics in Lancaster, New York. If you're a serious comic book collector, just starting out your collection, or maybe you're just a casual reader, then you have to check out 3D Comics in Lancaster, New York. From graded comics, custom art lithographs, limited edition prints and statues, 3D Comics is a must-see for the serious enthusiast, but the laid-back atmosphere is perfect for anyone with a love for comic books and more. They also specialize in custom art Funko Pops, taking regular Funko Pops and having a team of artists do original art on the boxes. Each comes with a certificate of authenticity. Located at 32 Central Ave in the heart of the village of historic Lancaster, New York, 3D Comics is open Wednesday through Saturday, 10 to 6, with special appointments available on Sundays. Find them online at 3dcomicsandmore.com. That's the number 3, the letter D, comicsandmore.com. And if you prefer to shop online, owner Joel Sharmani has tons of items available on eBay. Find a quick link to that on the shop's homepage. They also feature in-store appearances from today's hottest artists, special offers, and every Wednesday is New Comic Book Day. Give them a call at 716-860-7837, visit them online right now at 3dcomicsandmore.com, or better yet, just stop on in. But no matter where you are around the round world, 3D Comics is your destination for the best in comic books, custom art, and beyond. 3D Comics and More. That's the number 3, the letter D, comicsandmore.com. Tell them Uncle Josh sent you.